very, very much. Then it's my great pleasure to wish you all welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Liv Tørres. I'm the director of Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies. And I have the pleasure to welcome you all to this very timely discussion. First, I'd like to thank Canada for co-hosting, the government of Canada, not only for co-hosting, but also taking the initiative to this timely debate that we are going to have. And I think we all realized that this is timely at point of departure. We saw the events unfolding last year with the massive mobilization and protests against injustices, starting with the murder of Floyd in the US, but it put racism and the fight against racism in the middle of the public debate all over the world. I think we are also acutely aware that the topics we are going to discuss today, discrimination, racism, how to build more inclusive societies, are at the core of an increasingly polarized world, both at the national level and at the global level. And I must add also, for me personally, who survived a terror attack 10 years ago, 22nd July in Norway, this was very much at the bottom, at the core of the terrorists' agenda when he attacked the government quarters in Oslo 10 years ago, and later youth and kids at Utøya, just outside Oslo. Racism, he wanted to stop basically a more inclusive, multicultural society. So this is not only a timely debate, but I think it's also to many of us a very personal debate and an issue, and a personal commitment to make sure that we contribute to inclusion and to overcome prejudice, racism, and discrimination. I have a great group of people to talk about these issues. We have Mr. Maninder Sidhu, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development from Canada. I have Epsy Campbell Barr, First Vice President, Costa Rica. We have Hina Jilani, Advocate of the Supreme Court, Pakistan, and co-chair of the Task Force on Justice and a member of the Elders. Francisco Tzay, UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People. And we have Romina Buarini, Director of the Center for Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainable and Equal Opportunities of the OECD. And finally, Faisa Shaheen, my colleague, the Program Lead of Inclusion and Reducing Inequality at the Pathfinder for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies at CIC NYU. So with those few words, let me actually hand it over to Maninder Sidhu first to address us all. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Liv. Hello, and thank you to all for being here today, and to Canada's co-host for this event, Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies, and our partner, the government of Costa Rica. Let me start by expressing my gratitude for this opportunity to speak, and to each and every one of you for your commitment to eliminating racism, xenophobia, and discrimination for all. We are at a time of reckoning. More than ever before, people around the world recognize that racism is a systemic problem that requires a systemic response. Racism is at the root of discrimination and social exclusion, and a barrier to inclusive, just, prosperous, and peaceful societies. And we have seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified and multiplied inequalities, disproportionately affecting vulnerable communities. The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated social exclusion, xenophobia, and scapegoating, with a sharp increase of hate speech and crimes against minority communities around the world. Until we have peaceful, just, and inclusive societies free from discrimination, we cannot hope to have sustainable development. That is why I am proud to announce funding through Canada's Office of Human Rights, Freedom and Inclusion for the Pathfinders Grand Challenge on Inequality and Exclusion through a $1.8 million commitment to Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies. This project will help participating states combat inequality and exclusion through evidence-based solutions and political commitments, policies, and measures that promote equality and inclusion. Canada is proud to be one of the Pathfinders, a group of 39 UN member states, international organizations, global partnerships, and civil society partners across the world who are working together to accelerate progress on the SDG targets for peace, justice, and inclusion. Most of the participating governments in the Grand Challenge are countries that have either recently undergone democratic transition after periods of conflict or authoritarian rule, or have faced civil strife at crucial historical junctures. Pathfinder's Grand Challenge on Inequality and Exclusion is one way that we can work together to address this racism, xenophobia, and discrimination that prevents us from achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. This challenge seeks to identify practical and viable solutions to meet the targets on equitable and inclusive societies and the Sustainable Development Goals. The 2030 Agenda itself, with its 17 SDGs, provides an entry point for addressing racism, xenophobia, and discrimination, especially SDG 16, with the goal to promote just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. Addressing racism is important always, but especially at this time in Canada's history. Recently, the remains of hundreds of Indigenous children have been found buried around residential schools, where for more than a century, thousands of Indigenous children were forced to live after being torn from their families. These colonial institutions are a dark and shameful part of Canada's history, and today as a country, Canadians are confronting uncomfortable truth about their past and present. These findings also deepen the pain that families, survivors, and all Indigenous peoples and communities are already feeling. Canadians must also come to terms with the fact that systemic racism, discrimination, and injustice are what Indigenous peoples and communities have faced over centuries. We mourn for these lost and innocent children who died while at residential schools, and for those who have made it home but continue to experience emotional and physical trauma. The hurt and trauma are Canada's responsibility to bear, and we must strengthen our resolve to support the families, the survivors, and Indigenous communities. We also recognize that systemic racism remains a lived reality that harms not only Indigenous people, but also Black Canadians, Asian Canadians, and other racialized ethnic and religious communities across our country. Canada strives to be an inclusive country that respects and values diversity, but we still have much to do collectively. That is why Canada is working closely with provinces and territories, Indigenous partners, and community organizations to support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis to build a better and more inclusive future. This commitment builds on a domestic anti-racism strategy launched in 2019 to apply an anti-racism lens for all federal policies, while also empowering communities to lead initiatives that tackle root causes of racism. Inclusion and diversity are at the core of the Canadian public policy, driving our global affairs, notably in peace building, development, trade, and foreign policy. Canada's feminist international system policy commits us to providing international assistance that is human rights based and inclusive, so that the voices of the people living in the most marginalized situations and circumstances are taken into account as we develop our programs. Canada was also co-sponsor of the Costa Rica-led resolution adopted by acclamation at the UN in late 2020, proclaiming August 31st as the International Day of People of African Descent. As part of our anti-racism strategy, we have the domestic and international mandate of Canada's first special envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism, the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, the Honorable Irwin Cotler. We remain steadfast in implementing Canada's anti-racism strategy and the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We also welcome the efforts of UN entities to address the issue of racism and racial discrimination, including against people of African descent, as well as the effects of racial discrimination in propagating inequality. Now is the time to reverse the culture of denial and undertake an honest reckoning of systemic racism so that we can move forward with a truly transformational agenda that will dismantle systemic racism once and for all. This is a prerequisite to achieving a peaceful, just, and inclusive world. Working together through multilateral action, we can build and maintain momentum. We can address this global crisis with coordinated action, mutual support, transparent governance, and inclusive approaches that ensure people live in the most vulnerable situations and circumstances that people that live in the most vulnerable situations and circumstances are part of the solution from beginning to end. In closing, we must maintain momentum by working collectively to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals for all. That is why we urge countries to get on board, collaborate with communities, civil society, and international organizations to address systemic racism for a more peaceful, just, and inclusive society for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for well-spoken, good, important points, and not the least for Canada's role in spearheading this fight against discrimination and racism. I'd like to hand it over next to another country which is very much spearheading peaceful, just, and inclusive societies as well, and a very close friend of the Pathfinders. Let me hand it over to Epsy Campbell Barr, and who is the first Vice President of Costa Rica. And it's a great pleasure to hand the screen over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Liv. Distinguished participants and dear friends, it's a great honor for my government of Costa Rica to be co-host in this panel organized by the government of Canada at the Pathfinder for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies. And also alongside the high-level political forum in the context of the midterm of the International Decade for People of African Descent, the Decade of Action of SDGs, and the Black Lives Matter movement. As Vice President of Costa Rica, a country that has carried forward the banner of human rights, I am committed to continue raising national, regional, and global action for the eradication of racism and discrimination in all forms and expression to advance towards equality, justice, and inclusion for all. Today, more than ever, it's essential that recognize that Afro-descendants, Indigenous, and other groups and communities suffer from inequality with unacceptable obstacles for their entire economic, social, and political development due to systemic racism that persists in our society. Let me focus on Afro-descendants people. The United Nations General Assembly adopted last December a resolution presented by Costa Rica and co-sponsored by 52 other countries to proclaim August 21st as the International Day of Afro-Descendants. With this date, which we will celebrate for the first time this year, we will recognize the contribution of Afro-descendant people and community throughout the world and their struggle to combat forms of racism and racial discrimination. With this initiative, Costa Rica wants to do justice to the struggle, hopes, and resistance of Afro-descendants worldwide, bringing to light the milestone in a context of growing mobilization for racial justice, inequality, and non-discrimination. As you may know, global protest and movement against racism and other forms of systemic discrimination and oppression reflect a rising public demand to tackle exclusion and justice and inequality. Just today, the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, will present a report about systemic racism and what we can do to combat it together. Systemic racism against Black people all over the world. There is a global recognition of the reality of racism and exclusion suffered by people of African descent worldwide, which reports from international organizations have exposed the UN National Population Fund, the Economic Commission for Latin America, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Organization of States, among others. It is estimated that there are at least 150 million people of African descent in Latin America, more than 1 almost 200 in all the continent. Poverty is the norm and the most common situation in which this community live. This situation has historical causes and contemporary explanation to the pure distribution of wealth. The states haven't fulfilled the responsibility to guarantee the well-being of their inhabitants without any discrimination. To mention two facts, people of African descent are 2.5 times more likely to live in poverty than white people. In addition, according to the World Bank report, only the 64% of people of African descent finish primary education in Latin America. Ethnic, racial inequality make one of the structuring axes of the matrix of social inequality in the continent, and racism is a central element of the culture of privilege that persists and is reproduced in our countries. With this conviction that we will be capable to dismantling the complex web of deficiencies, violation of rights, and equality that affect the Afro-descendant population. The government of Costa Rica presented last year together with the UNFPA and ECLAC the report Afro-Descendants and the Matrix of Inequality, Social in America Latina. Challenge for exclusion. We know all the facts, but we need to act now. The road to recovery from the pandemic must address and reserve decades of exclusion and prejudice and build system and institution that work for all people while leaving no one behind. That is why Costa Rica will launch this year, with the support of governments and civil society, the Global Coalition Against Racism and Racial Discrimination. This global coalition would include the necessary coordination with commitment leaders as international organization and the private sector as indicated by the SDG 17 to promote and guarantee practical action for human rights of all the people, especially in this issue for Afro-descendants, and fight against racism. In this road to inclusion, we also need to make visible the Afro agenda with a respective reparation action to raise the voices of Afro-descendant women and join people to strengthen the work of human rights organization against racism, to carry out a rigorous balance of the Third World Conference Against Racism and the necessary action to close the gap faced by Afro-descendants. From my office, we are also articulating a regional campaign against racism with the support of Central American Integration System, the World Bank, the United Nations Population Fund, and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. People for African descent have, without a doubt, the strength and resilience of our ancestors. We overcame significant obstacles by taking extraordinary steps to achieve rights, justice, and democracy. We are part of a generation of brave men and women, fighters capable of turning history and loss into freedom and pain into hope. And that is why we must join forces to support the demands of young people crying out for recognition, justice, development, and the eradication of racism worldwide. It's time of transformation and global demand for justice. We need to emphasize the highest cost of exclusion and deepening inequalities and explore practical approaches to build more inclusive society that respect diversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm truly impressed by the leadership of Costa Rica and very happy that we have Canada and Costa Rica co-hosting and leading the struggle to fight discrimination, prejudice, and racism. With those words, I'd like to hand it over to Hina Jilani, advocate of the Supreme Court, Pakistan, co-chair of the Task Force on Justice, representing the elders. And on top of all of this, you were also part of the Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence against people of African descent in the United States and delivered that report just recently. We're looking forward to hear what you will say, Hina Jilani. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Liv. I first of all want to thank the Global Affairs Canada and Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies for bringing us all together in order to speak about something which I think is very timely and very important. Today I speak in my role as a member of the Elders, an independent group of global leaders formed by Nelson Mandela in 2007. The Elders have always been committed to promoting human rights as a foundation for freedom, justice, and peace. Never has this foundation been more important as humanity tries to forge a more inclusive future and meet the goals of the 2030 agenda. I've always felt that times of crisis can be a fertile breeding ground for radical change. This change might be a little painful to achieve while we are striving for the change. However, I also feel that this is something that we have to strive for, and our endeavors do bring results if there is a genuine commitment to do so. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has not just allowed the shroud to be lifted on injustice, it has also exacerbated inequalities. And I think we have all experienced that in the past year and a half. We have become more acutely aware of the attitudes and structures that underpin and perpetuate racism, misogyny, homophobia, and other forms of prejudice and discrimination. We have also become more aware that justice systems are simply not delivering what people need. They often fail to remedy injustice. And in the case of abuses, they can actively contribute to injustice. Poor practice, and in some cases, the complete absence of justice systems that work for the people, result in the ostracism of some of the most vulnerable in our societies. We are seeing a surge in trends of racism, xenophobia, religious divides, and intolerance that have led not just to discrimination and marginalization of minorities, but also violence, social tensions, and conflict. No country is spared tragic events that alert us time and again to how urgent it has become for everyone to rally against these trends nationally and globally. I come from South Asia, and when I look around in my own country, Pakistan, and in all the neighboring countries and other countries in my region, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, I can tell you that we as the civil society in this region have very serious concerns about the future of minorities and the way that intolerance is making it impossible for us to reduce and mitigate social conflicts and even violence in our region. Mr. Cali is here, and Francisco Cali is here. I really appreciate your work, Mr. Cali, for the Indigenous community globally. And we have just heard His Excellency, Mr. Sidhu, about the Indigenous populations and the recent trauma that the Canadian population is going through because of those incidents in the past. These are things that we want to eradicate from our memories as soon as we can, but eradicate them in a way in which we are able to bring the victims some satisfaction and some conclusion to the events of the past that they have suffered. I also feel that it is important for us to remember that there are now rising concerns and there are some hotspots that we need to look at. I will mention Afghanistan, for instance, where the rising tensions now are placing communities, minority communities like the Hazaras at a great risk. So I'm just drawing attention through this platform of yours to the upcoming concerns that we have all over the world. Amid the sweeping standstill of the COVID-19 health emergency, the visceral public reaction to George Floyd's murder resonated beyond the shores of the United States. And this is what I want other communities that are isolated in their national situations also to be heard. George Floyd's murder, in fact, was a seminal moment in June 2020, that in the midst of the pandemic, the collective memory of traumatic experiences for millions of people emerged and spilled over onto the streets and onto newsreels and was heard all over the world. The massive protests that followed the death of George Floyd were a global civic response to the structural injustices and long-standing inequalities that have marginalized people because of their race for decades. The police officer who killed Floyd has now been convicted of murder and sentenced to more than 22 years in prison. But the Black Lives Matter protests achieved something more consequential. The creation of this international commission on which I served, as Liv mentioned earlier, to examine police racism in the US. We found that the persistent systemic racism against African Americans in the US constitutes a crime against humanity and merits an investigation by the International Criminal Court. Let us not neglect other situations around the world and give justice to those who have suffered injustice historically in a timely manner. There are many recommendations in the report of this commission pertinent to the United States, but also to us as a global community. There are two I want to highlight today. Firstly, we found patterns of obstruction of justice and collusion within the justice system that enabled impunity for the perpetrators of violence. We must avoid and end impunity to ensure that justice is served to those who are on the receiving end of such appalling violations and abuses. We must make sure that hopelessness does not set in amongst the victims. Secondly, the report rightly highlights the need to focus on protection from injustice. We found the blame for systemic racist police violence to go beyond individual officers, jurisdictions, or agencies, and called upon the US government to ratify and enforce the international human rights treaties to show a commitment to structural change. When we think about injustice, it is vital we also recognize the gulf that can exist between the promise of justice and the realities experienced on the ground. Discriminatory social norms remain powerful obstacles to justice for many, especially for women and girls, and even more so for women and girls of color. Gender parity by 2030 must be inclusive of all women, regardless of their race, sexuality, class, or religion. This must also mean improved representation for women within the institutions and agencies of justice and law at every level of society. when I say every level of society, I also mean that women must have a place at the table in all political structures nationally. At the international level, I urge all multilateral organizations and forums like the UN to make sure that women are there in decision-making structures and not just relegated one section where, either the UN Women or just special rapporteurs on violence against women. They must be there in all political decision-making and all decision-making in the human rights arm of the United Nations. Countries must enact mechanisms, guidelines, and standards, including temporary special measures in times of crisis, to ensure that women and communities of color are equally represented throughout the justice workforce and equal parity in justice institutions, national and international, by 2030. Governments, the private sector, and philanthropists should invest in legal empowerment and justice services, particularly those delivered by women's groups and communities of color. Such services are vital to preventing and responding to gender-based violence, racism, bigotry, polarization, hate speech, and holding perpetrators accountable. Investments should focus on people furthest behind, particularly women from low-income backgrounds, racial and ethnic minorities, and refugee and migrant communities. Even more deserving of attention are children who are subjected to child labor, to slave-like practices, and those who have become even more vulnerable to abuse because of their race, religion, and caste. In this pause created by a health emergencies, we have become increasingly aware of the deep visions that weave their way through society. We must not go back to the status quo after this pandemic. The status quo wasn't healthy, fair, or just. Instead, we must take this opportunity to address and reverse decades of exclusion and prejudice, and to build systems and institutions that work for people, leaving no one behind in the efforts to recover from COVID-19 and deliver the promise of sustainable development goals. Only by addressing root problems of discrimination and exclusion can we achieve more inclusive and equitable societies grounded in dignity and respect for diversity. I am not unaware of the challenges that will stand in the way of achieving the goal of equality, inclusion, and justice. But as a human rights defender, I know that when there is a committed endeavor to fight injustice, success is not impossible. And together we can achieve this goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hina, Jilani. Crystal clear, as always, human rights defender, and providing us always with food for thought, for reflection, and the ideological pillars and value pillars for reset and recovery after COVID. She has already introduced you, Francisco Cali, but I'm still passing it on. You are the special rapporteur on UN rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people, and I'm sure you listened very carefully to the Canadian Mr. Sidhu in the beginning of our events. Now I'd like to hand it over to you to address the issues and take it forward. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Liv. And I just wanted to start thanking Ms. Hina Jilani for the introduction. And I hope that I will fulfill what she has said on defending the rights of Indigenous peoples. Of course, I'm thanking to Canada, Costa Rica, and Pathfinder program for organizing this important event. And as everybody knows, the struggle against racism and other forms of systemic discrimination and oppression has obligating the citizens from all over the world, raising their voice, demanding the states to tackle exclusion, injustice, and inequality. And in the case that I am in charge of Indigenous peoples, Of course, people are asking to respect the indigenous people's right. As my predecessors taking the word has been mentioned, COVID-19. COVID-19 has exacerbated the level of injustice against indigenous people. And today they are afraid, especially seeing how some government and some transnational are taking advantage of the war emergency for not fulfilling their international commitment on respecting indigenous people's right of consultation. Of course, there are many common misconceptions on the existence of indigenous peoples. Some believe that only the indigenous people who are living, for example, in Canada, US, in reservations are indigenous people, are the full indigenous people. In other parts of the world, the people who are living in the rural areas, they are the real indigenous peoples. But there is another reality also, and they are suffering more racial discrimination in this moment, and are indigenous people who are living in urban areas. Sometimes they have been attacking, telling them that they are less authentic or not genuine indigenous peoples. In contrast, indigenous people in urban areas may rather receive themselves as an extension of the home territory. And we have to understand also that indigenous people who are living in urban areas, they are living in their own territory in this moment. Cities have been built on the ancestral territory that the indigenous people occupied before the colonizer came to these lands or to their lands. So I think that that is very important to take in account. And as stated in the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights in Article 2, indigenous people and individuals are free and equal to all other people and individuals and have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in the exercise of the rights, in particular that based on the indigenous origin or identity. And talking about the structural racism and racial discrimination, that it doesn't allow people to recognize the historical event. And I congratulate Canada in this in this moment, because they are recognizing what has happened to indigenous people in Canada, especially on the issue that is taking place on residential school. I think that there is time for Canada in this moment to take a step ahead on the reconciliation and to fulfill the recommendation of the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation of Canada. I believe that that is something you have a very strong instrument in your hands. And I think that the opportunity is today to recognize, not only to recognize, but also to reconcile with indigenous people or the First Nations of Canada. The pandemic has been exacerbated, as I said, the racial discrimination against indigenous people, and has been taking some companies have been taking advantage of this work emergency, taking over the land and territory of indigenous people on their economical interests, specifically the extractive industries and the construction of tourism complexes that are taking the land of the indigenous peoples. Of course, there are many other issues, as for example, protected areas, those policies that some governments are taking to protect areas, to take over the land of indigenous people, because that is the only way that they are going to take over the land, and they are not taking in account the people who are living there and who have been in charge of the balance between development and environment. Those people have been living there for hundreds or thousands of years, and they were able to have that environment that now some government want to protect, but not taking in account those people who have been the responsible protecting of that areas. I am worried also about the human rights defenders attacks. We have been seeing that the emergency has been imposing to indigenous people the lockdown. So the lockdown has been giving the opportunity to those industries or those companies to know exactly where the human rights defenders are. And it has been easy for them to kidnap, to kill them, or even to go to their communities and to threaten them that if they continue with their work, they will be suffering the consequences. And I think that that is very important to say in this moment, because this has been part specifically of the practice of racism and racial discrimination that Indigenous people are suffering. The pandemic has also bring to our attention the lack of access of medicine of Indigenous peoples. And that is very important because to attack the pandemic or the pandemic is necessary the vaccination. In this moment, I take also the opportunity to congratulate Canada and United States for giving a priority to Indigenous people for the vaccination. That is very important because the lack of health that Indigenous people have has been more strongly affected by the pandemic. Education in this moment is a luxury for Indigenous people, especially in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, because we have to take in account that the education now is given in a different way, as we are now today in a very, we can say, electronic way, the education that has been putting education, access of education, a luxury that not many Indigenous people have that opportunity to have education. And of course, I think that it's very important to say that the respect of the cultural rights of Indigenous people is very important in this moment. I think that everybody knows that the loss of one language is the loss of the centuries of knowledge. And if we lose one language, we never are going to be able to recuperate that knowledge that those people had in their words. Reports have been said that every 2 weeks, one language die. So that means that in 30, 50 years, there are more than 50% of the Indigenous languages will disappear if government doesn't take any measures to protect the right of Indigenous people to speak their own languages. I think that there are many issues that we can speak about the situation of Indigenous people. Specifically, they are affected by situation where Indigenous people is suffering the takeover of their lands, often leading to forced removal and relocation. Extractive activities, as I said before, and development projects are leading, pushing and driving Indigenous people to urbanization and natural and environmental disasters, political instability, militarization, and armed conflict are additional key causes that are making more unjust situation for Indigenous people. As Ms. Jilani was saying, I believe that in this moment, only human solidarity will become the key issue to fight against racism and racial discrimination, and to take also in account all people for having an equal level of life. I am very thankful to you, Liv, and to organizer for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for very good comments indeed. And I'd like us to return to policy tools and how to go forward. Also at the very end, reminding everyone that the chat box is open. I've seen some people starting already asking questions, and I'd like us to come back to the Q&A at the very, very end. But now we are going to hear Romina Buarini, representing the OECD, who's been working on these issues for a long time. So please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Liv, and thanks so much to Pathfinders for organizing this very important event And a big thank you and congratulations to Canada and Costa Rica for such a strong leadership on this important topic. I have a few slides, so if the organizer could please upload them. And to start, I would like to really very quickly tell you about the WISE Center that we created last year at the OECD and that I have the pleasure to direct. And the reasons why it is important for you to be aware of that is actually, you can go to the next slide, please, is actually that the center was actually created as a statement to the mission that the OECD wants to move forward with, which is expanding and mainstreaming the work on inclusion and equal opportunity. And so this is obviously core to the discussion we're having today. We have in what we're doing a lot of focus on measuring. I'm going to mention some of the issues that we are working on right now that of course relate to the issues of race, ethnicity, but also the indigenous people. So we are doing a lot of work that look at the well-being of those groups. And of course, all the issues of access to services and different type of policies, how those communities are served. We are also clearly not just looking at the statistical agenda. We start with the data always, but then we really apply and unpack that for policies. And so we, of course, try to draw sort of insights and provide our governments with recommendations in terms of how to fight against discrimination, how to promote inclusion and equal opportunity. And of course, we are also partnering directly with countries on all those themes, and we do a lot of work in connections with SDGs, but also with inclusive growth and well-being, more generally speaking. And currently, we are looking a lot at the issues of quality of the recovery. And so in the end of this presentation, I will tell you a bit more about how we are actually framing the quality of the recovery from the perspective of people's well-being and how we are, in fact, embracing the notions of inclusion, diversity, and equal opportunity within this work that looks at the recovery right now. Next slide, please. Obviously, the OECD has done a lot of work to quantify the social and economic cost of discriminations. What we had so far is really that, of course, fighting discrimination is a moral imperative. But we actually in the OECD also believe, and we have a lot of empirical evidence that shows that this is also an economic imperative. If you start just by looking at the issues of gender equality, clearly the data points on the economic to a strong economic cost when it comes to gender gaps on the labor side. This is partly indicated in this slide. We have done work that estimates that reducing the gender gap in labor force by 25% by 2025 could actually add 1 percentage point to GDP growth over the period 13-25, but almost 2.5 percentage points if gender participation gaps were halved. More broadly speaking, we've done research that shows that reducing the gender gaps in the access to quality jobs can also reduce income inequality, but also support household incomes during economic downturns. And that's exactly where countries stand right now, as you all know. And actually reducing gender disparities can also do a lot to consolidate the position of the middle class that in fact has weakened in a great number of OECD countries in the last few years. Evidence also shows that racial discrimination is both strong and widespread. This is confirmed by a large body of field experiments that show the strong discrimination against ethnic and racial minorities in hiring. And here you have a chart that comes from work that has been done in our Directorate of Employment, looking at meta-analysis of 43 studies of hiring discrimination. And the charts on the slides actually just show how big is the discrimination right now in 4 countries in the OECD. You have the United States, Canada, France, and the UK. And the numbers that you can see actually look at what we call the callback ratios for selected countries. That is the number of applications minority job applicants need to send compared to a member of the majority group in order to be called for an interview. of course, on top of those interesting data, we're also looking at surveys, and surveys in particular that look at the self-report or the perceptions that people have around the extent of discriminations. And there we found that a small majority of people in the OECD, actually only a small majority, think that their city or area are a good place to live for minorities. So it means that, in fact, almost one individual in two in the OECD population believe that the place where they're living is really not good from the perspective of tolerance tolerance for racial and ethnic minority groups. We can go to next slide, please. Now, as I said, one of the very entry points for us in WISE is really looking at the costs of racial discrimination, starting from compiling sound, robust statistics around the well-being of minority groups. And we've done some work a couple of years ago that actually was showing quite, I would say, sad picture when it comes to just data availability and basic information availability on diversity. And so, in fact, it is in only 8 to 14 OECD countries that we can find solid statistics with respect to that cover the living conditions and the well-being of indigenous populations. And when we start looking at the notion of race, ethnicity, we tend to find a slightly broader coverage with 16 to 38 OECD countries, including some of those statistics, let's say, in the daily statistical programs at national level. And so it's only when you look at the migrant status, so it's only when you're able to track individuals according to their migration status that you can actually draw and portray a very comprehensive pictures in OECD countries. But so the bottom line of this slide is that as soon as you want to go really granular and really finer, when you want to understand the well-being and the perspectives of indigenous identities, for instance, it is actually in a very, very small number of countries that you get robust data. So clearly, for us, one of the very important priority for our work program in WISE is actually to back to the data and statistics on diversity in order to make groups more visible and obviously support all the policies, processes that are needed to address those inequalities. But really, if we don't have the basic data, we can't do very much. And actually, we, of course, have been extremely happy and delighted to see that at the moment, there are a number of countries in the OECD that are really leading a very strong statistical agenda of those issues. Clearly, of course, in the wake of the growing demands for racial justice, the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the many other similar movements that we have seen in a lot of OECD countries. Let me just quote the very important initiative that the US Biden-Harris administration has taken to actually create an interagency working group on equitable data. And that group is tasked with improving federal data collections and measuring the equity impacts of laws. So it really starts with the data, but also looking at the extent to which any type of policies, any type of regulation is going to have a very specific impact on the minorities. And so it's really about mainstreaming a very thorough sort of assessment of the distributional impacts of public policies. So in the OECD, we will, of course, pick up this agenda, and we will work strongly and closely with those countries, and in particular will very much support not just the development of solid indicators around discrimination and fair treatment, but also we will precisely try to evaluate public policies from the perspective of discrimination. Next slide, please. At the moment, one of the main projects WISE is working on is looking at the COVID impacts on people's well-being. So we have a well-being framework that was launched by the OECD almost 15 years ago, and it is really a framework that looks at all the important dimensions of people's life that matter to people. So we really look at a number of economic and non-economic outcomes for people. It also looks at the drivers of well-being over time, because we also look at the assets and resources that are generating sustainably those well-being outcomes. And so, of course, a very important aspect of this work is being able to unpack this framework and really populate it with statistics for all groups in the population. So we're going back to this idea that we're looking at distribution of those outcomes systematically in the work that we do on well-being in WISE. And as other had said before, other panelists have said before, of course, the work that we have just conducted show that the racial and ethnic minorities have actually suffered the worst outcomes on the labor market. You have a chart that shows evidence from the United States. That chart says that while by April 2021, the unemployment rates had fallen from their April 2028 for all ethnicities, the gaps between white and blacks, as well the Hispanic, Latino demographic groups actually had widened. So the gaps sort of as a whole, the absolute gaps went down, but actually the relative gaps became even larger. And in particular, the women of color were the ones that, in fact, they were the ones hit the most, because they were, of course, the ones that were employed in hard-hit leisure and hospitality services. And so, you know, they are the ones certainly that when it comes to labor markets, but also incomes and earnings have suffered the most dramatic consequences, and also are the ones that may suffer from the most long-lasting consequences. So we know that the scarring effects are likely to be larger for these groups. Next slide, please. So it's not just about material well-being and economic conditions. It's also really try to understand the quality of life and all that relates to non-material aspects of people's well-being. So in our well-being scan, we actually look at what happened to a number of groups in the population. And again, in these slides, I'm just focusing on racial and ethnic minorities, but in the broader work we're doing and that we will publish at the end of the year, of course, we come out with a much broader picture, for instance, looking also at gender and youth, etc. And so what we look at is things such as mental health, for instance. And we know that, again, this is a chart that you see in the slide, that in the United States, the gaps in mental health outcomes between different racial and ethnic groups was more in 19 before the pandemic hit, but those gaps actually widened very significantly in 2020 as overall levels of anxiety and depression shot up during the pandemic. In fact, on average, in the United States, more than 40% of Black and Hispanic ethnicity showed and reported symptoms of anxiety or a depressive disorder. And that is just compared, so this 40% just compares with the 35% on white in the white group and 31% in the group of Asian origin. Similar patterns have been found in other OECD countries, and notably in the UK and Canada. So the conclusion really, yes, I am done.
Sorry, you have to start wrapping up.
Yes, absolutely. In conclusion, it is really important that all recovery packages are going to be designed with a special focus on minorities to ensure that no one is left behind. So we are recommending to all countries to make sure that the recovery measures are fully inclusive and really are there to ensure that the creation of new jobs is going to be one that profits essentially, I mean, especially the ones that have been hit the most the pandemic. Thank you.
So sorry to push you on time, Romina. I wanted to check whether, I know that the first Vice President Costa Rica has to leave in very, very short time. So I wanted to see whether she had 2 minutes to come in before I hand it over to Faisa to just address maybe a question that will come back to all the other panelists at the very end. But are you able to just highlight the most important policy tools that we need to mobilize now behind in order to address the challenges? Epsy, please.
Thank you very much, Liv, and thank you all. I only want to say a few words in this roundtable and also to think in the future. We have to involve young people just now to the fight against racism and racial discrimination, especially Black young people and also Indigenous people, and those who suffer discrimination in all over the countries. Second one, I think that we have to reinforce a kind of network, international network, to fight against racism and racial discrimination. This is the time. We don't have no time. The data that Romina showed us explain the results about racism, not only in terms of the reality of the societies and the economies, but especially in terms of the rights of people today. I think that I want to thank you a lot, Liv, and your organization, and also Canada. This is one of the most important year because we are in the middle term of the decade. We are 10 years after the conference against racism and racial discrimination. We are in terms of the Black Lives Movement, and we have to do more than we are done in the last years. We have to put the issue of racism and racial discrimination in the center of the debate of human rights, but not only in the center of the debate of human rights, in the center of the debate of democracy. We can have democracy if we have the kind of the results and the racism that we had now in our society. Thank you. Please do. We have to do more. We have to do more, and we have to reinforce our alliances to change the world and to fight against racism and racial discrimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And it's definitely true. We have to do more and a lot more. And Costa Rica is definitely taking the leadership role in that fight, but a lot more has to come in together with Costa Rica, Canada, and others. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm sure we will be in touch. I'm going to hand it over now to my great colleague, Faisa Shaheen, who is heading our work on inequality and exclusion. Please, Faisa, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us today and for the speeches before. I'm going to focus really on the solutions. You'll know at the Grand Challenge we're very much focused on what we can do about these issues. But I want to just start really talking about the realities of racism, something that I've been thinking about very much this morning. As you can tell from my accent, I'm from England, and we've just been on this roller coaster ride watching football in the European tournament. And for those of you that don't know, we lost last night in the finals on penalties. But what pains me today is not the loss of the game, is the racism that I knew would come as soon as a Black player missed a penalty. And waking up today, looking at what's happening in the UK, reading the news, looking at my Twitter feed, looking at what was happened on the Instagram posts of those Black footballers who missed penalties, horrific racism that is there. It's really unfortunately a very predictable thing, but a very painful reality. One of the young players, Saka, who's only 19 years old, had to deactivate his Instagram account this morning. The racial abuse was, an avalanche. And it's a reminder, in terms of football, every Black player is one game away, one missed goal away from a torrent of racist abuse. It's a story of acceptance with conditions. And it's a story that so many minority groups know all around the world. And I think, reading last night about Black and brown young people that were out watching the game, feeling immediately unsafe, having to move together and exit quickly because of fear of safety. It's really quite disturbing that is the state. And that's not just the state, again, for England, it's a state for many countries around the world. And it's completely predictable, given that we didn't have the political leadership that we needed. I think it would be naive, though, to think about racism as just a few football fans. I've seen people today tweet about, that kind of hate, that kind of prejudice. We know it's far more deep-rooted. And unfortunately, it's not just a minority pursuit. It's something deeply embedded in our economy, in our institutions, in our psyches, and too often encouraged in political narratives. I think we have to be honest that sometimes too often politicians see that there is a benefit in the short term for them dividing us so that they can win elections. And at the centre, in the Inequality and Exclusion team, we've been running various different analysis of those intersections, but I did want to start by that reality. I think we can lose sometimes the reality when we look just at the numbers of how painful it is to live in societies when your belonging and your acceptance is continually questioned and continually examined. So, we looked across a number of countries and looked at this overlap between wealth inequalities and discrimination against particular groups. And I'm not going to go into this in any depth. Romino's already brought this up and articulated the work that OECD is doing. But wherever we looked in the world, wherever we could get the data, over about 60 countries, we could see that again and again, minoritized groups that have had historical prejudice were much more likely to be in the bottom quintile of wealth. So in Serbia, a Roma person is 7 times more likely to be among the poorest households. In Pakistan, a Marwari person is 6 times more likely to be among the poorest households. In Peru, someone that speaks an indigenous language is 5 times more likely to be amongst the poorest households. And again, this is wherever we looked. Rich country, middle income country, poor country, just a consistent finding. And it will be published in our flagship report in September. And it's not a coincidence. We know it's not a coincidence for groups that have prejudice to be always found at the bottom. But it's not just about prejudice. The economy in itself is often reinforcing hierarchies. And it raises questions about economic inequality overall, because if there are huge disparities in society in terms of income and wealth, then we will know that particular groups will be at the bottom. Where those disparities are more narrow, then there is a higher ability for groups at the bottom to do well over time. We find that again when we look at more equal countries. And of course, we as policymakers, we shouldn't be thinking about just simply doing something so that there's more Black and brown people, minoritized groups at the top of society. The idea is not to equalize misery at the bottom amongst groups, of course not. So we are in the work very clear that it's about both economic inequality, wealth and income-based inequalities, alongside group-based inequalities, and that those two things are deeply interwoven. In September, as I said, we'll publish a flagship report, and we'll very much be looking at the solutions. And I just want to bring out some of those solutions that are coming out in the research. I know that a few questions have been asked about that too. And of course, no surprises, there's no one thing that will fix this deep-rooted problem. But in looking at the policies across the many policies that we need to take to address both economic and group-based prejudices, one big thing that we need to do and set as a target is solidarity building. Building trust between groups. And that requires a number of things. And firstly, this is something we've been looking at closely, is the ability to use tools that are often used in post-conflict societies. So reconciliation, social dialogues, ways of bringing people together, and making that peacemaking. And you know, to be clear, some of that is saying sorry. Saying sorry can go a long way. But it's also about listening to those groups, the opportunity to listen, and to take concrete steps to then address those problems. And so where we've seen those sorts of peace and reconciliation processes fail is where they've stopped short of what people wanted to change and the visible change that they wanted to see in their lives. So not just to be recognized as equal humans, but also to have access to good housing, for instance, and wealth building. Hina has spoken eloquently about the importance of justice systems, and seeing justice served. The importance of belonging, again, is very much encompassed in that. It's also about the way in which we teach our histories, what's in our curriculums, the celebration of different cultures, of different languages. It's about planning. It's how we're planning our cities, our towns, and our public services so that people are able to mix and have empathy for each other, to break down those historic prejudices that tell people some people work less hard, some people are more likely to be violent, those lies that we have been told again and again. You know, when we mix, when we connect, we realize that we are all humans, that we often care about the same things. As I said, it's about the economy, it's about economic redistribution, it is about social protection, it is about higher minimum wages, it is about access to good jobs, but it's also about allowing minoritized groups and groups that have been suffered from historical prejudice to build wealth on their own terms. And there's some really interesting things happening for Indigenous peoples, and Canada is a really good example of this, where Indigenous peoples are saying, actually, we want to have use our land for renewable energy, and we want support in doing that. And so it's very important that we don't take our ideas of wealth building and put that on groups that have different ideas of what it means to build wealth. It is critically about civil society as well. And you know, we've spoken about Black Lives Matter. But if we didn't have those movements, if we didn't have the ability to go out on the street, the politicians just wouldn't have the pressure on them to do the right thing. And that's just the case we see again and again. You know, it's really noticeable how in the US, you know, Biden is far more articulate about these issues now. And would that have happened without, you know, hundreds of thousands on the street? I think there is a real question of that. I was thinking that, and finally, though we haven't really thought about this yet, but it's something that just struck me listening to Canada and Costa Rica today about the need for political leadership, and often we have the opposite type of leadership. But this is really what this grand challenge is about. It's showing that there is political leadership around the world to give people hope, that there are people trying to do the right thing. And let me just end by saying something positive. And we will, in this, I've been told to keep my comments very short, but you know, there's a number of these areas that will be covered in the report in depth, and there are things we can do. And let me just end by saying that we've done a global poll asking people questions in our key countries. So from Canada and Sweden to Costa Rica and Mexico and Sierra Leone and Tunisia about what they're concerned about and the changes that they want to see. And I can't give the numbers yet because we're finalizing those, but the overwhelming majority in every single one of those countries is worried about divisions in their society. And that is a license for politicians to act. It's a reminder that people don't like to live in divisive societies, even if they are the majority group. I'll leave it there, but look forward to questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Faisa. That was very well spoken indeed. Yes, we want leadership, and we have a clear understanding of a lot of the tools and alternatives we have in order to address the challenges. We also know that we need to mobilize broadly. We need leadership, but we also need partnerships with civil society. So I'd like to actually open it up to the panel to address for 2-3 minutes at the very end, the tools needed, the partnerships needed, and what we have learned from the current or sort of recent mobilization. in order to take this forward. But before I hand it over to the panel you've already seen speaking, let me introduce Richard Arbeiter, who's the ambassador and deputy at the UN Canada mission, and who has jumped in as an excellent stand-in for Mr. Sidhu, who had to leave us. So I'm going to give the word to you first, Richard.
Well, thank you so much, Liv, and my apologies for the parliamentary secretary. Thanks to all the panel for sharing your insights and your wisdom. Did you want me to try to answer that question that you had posed about the best? Yes? Okay, well,
Canada is great on sort of giving us direction here and taking leadership. So I've got full trust in you. Take it forward.
All right, that's very kind. I mean, maybe in short order, and frankly, based on what I heard this morning and our own experience, first the importance of evidence and understanding what is the data and what is the data telling you. And if you read that evidence, it doesn't matter what country you're in, I hope that it gives you a dose of humility, because there is no country that is perfect or doesn't have a significant amount of work to do. On the basis of the evidence that they gather and on the basis of the lived experience of the population that the government is supposed to serve. So that would be my number one recommendation, is to approach this issue with humility. Thirdly, you'll have heard the parliamentary secretary refer to the anti-racism lens that we apply to all policy, expanding beyond that into a gender-based analysis and understanding that policies have implications for different segments of the population in different ways, different implications. And so that needs to be built in at conception phase of the policy design, not afterwards. You can adjust kind of throughout, but ensuring that you're using that lens is really important. Fourthly, partnerships. So, in Canada, yes, we have multiple levels of government, but I think the same is true everywhere. Most people, the greatest impact on most people is the local impact of the policies. And so, working particularly with municipal governments and understanding the experiences that people have, whether it's on their public transit, whether it's in their schools, in their supermarkets, and the things that people do every day, understanding how that experience is impacted. And policy can be made at the grocery store as much as it can be made at the federal level in your national experience. And then finally, and possibly most importantly, is the stakeholder consultation, and really building in what is that lived experience from those that suffer through the discrimination and the systemic racism, understanding their perspective and what is an important policy response that has an impact on that community. I think if you don't have those elements within your approach, they're not likely to be successful. They need to be born from that experience. They need to involve some partnership. They need to have that lens on it, and they need to be approached with sufficient humility to know that it may be wrong what you're trying. You will try it and you will learn from it, and you need to be prepared to adjust and adapt with it on the basis of continuing to gather the evidence, and hopefully you can move a little bit forward through those kinds of policy responses. Thanks very much for letting me step in, Lev. Back to you.
Thank you so much. And you were coming with additional points to those that have already been made. So that was very important indeed. Well, I'll actually come back to this a little bit at the very end, but I'd like to give the whole panel a couple of minutes. Unfortunately, very little time, but can I hand it to you first, Hina, Jilani, 2 minutes on the tools needed. How do we take this forward with what are the most important tools and partnerships as we move forward?
Thank you, Liv. That's a very good question, and I think deserves a lot of concentration on our parts if we want to achieve what we call transformation. I'm very encouraged by what His Excellency, the Ambassador, has just said, and some of what he has said, I think, are also, in my mind, some of the important issues that we must address, and the way in which these have to be addressed have also been said by him. For me, it's very important that people are able to express their views on how transformation can be achieved. What are the hotspots which governments have to address? And for that, it's very important that there must be no suppression of the freedom of expression. Governments must endeavor to open this issue of change and transformation in the post, after as we are recovering from the pandemic. For this, it's very important that we emphasize the importance of democratization, not only of states, but also of the society, so that the societies all over the world also understand the importance of equality and participation at all social levels. Secondly, I agree with the ambassador. Our experiences during this COVID pandemic has shown that where local government systems are non-existent or are weak, people escaped even the relief measures that governments were taking. So this is absolutely important that we concentrate on delivering at the local levels, and good local government structures are important for that. Parliaments are extremely important. If we want people to participate in debates, parliaments must take on this responsibility. And in countries where parliaments are weak, or where authoritarian structures are overruling parliamentary debates and dialogue with the people, I think they will not achieve anything at all. Secondly, I also believe that with the freedom of expression, the freedom to assemble and to protest must be fully guaranteed and protected in order for people to show their reaction to what governments propose, or where the governments are lacking in their ability to design a new structure which would be more fair for people. So I think that's very important. This is the way I think that social security nets can be established. I think universal healthcare is extremely important for people all over the world. So I do believe that there are measures that can be taken. The pandemic experience has pointed towards the inequalities and the injustices that we suffer. I think we need to just follow those directions where gaps have been identified.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Francisco Cali.
Well, thank you very much. I think that there are many things that, for example, for Indigenous people, that is necessary to do is to ratify the core human rights treaties and ILO Convention 169 and take effective measures to incorporate the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights into domestic legislation and policies, including local legislations, policies, and programs. And I congratulate Canada for taking that step already on taking the declaration into domestic law. So that is very important example. In taking account Indigenous right framework into public policies and planning to guarantee their individual and collective rights of Indigenous people. Of course, adopting legislative and policies measures prohibiting forced eviction and displacement, and ensuring the right to return of involuntary displacement of Indigenous people to their traditional land and territories. And of course, there are other rights that I believe that is necessary to respect, to put in practice the law that already has been adopted, because there are many countries that they have beautiful laws, but they are not in practice. They are not respecting their own laws. In another hand is that it's necessary that the countries recognize the existence of Indigenous people in their territory and to respect the rights of Indigenous people. As I said, there are many other things, but I will leave it in here in this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Romina, I hand it over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. Well, if I have to perhaps, summarize it with a quote, I would take the one from Cecilia Rouse. saying that inclusion is not a silo, because inclusion needs to, it takes all of the government approach and a whole of society approach. And when it comes to taking all of the government approach at OECD, we've been spreading the inclusive growth framework, and it says you need to really intervene at all points of the policy system. So this is about really providing opportunities from the start. So when it comes, to design and implementing public services in education, health, and we just discussed, especially right now in the context of providing, swift vaccination to the minorities, how important that is, but also, to provide medical treatment to those that actually have not follow any medical treatment due to the lockdowns and the different sort of restrictions. The second point, so within that same framework, is really about making sure that the labor markets are operating in a very inclusive manner, but also that there is business dynamism. So it's also not just about, it's not about promoting human rights, it's really redesigning the whole economy. And so even when we are actually, framing economic policies that looks at the dynamisms, the providing opportunity to small and medium enterprises, and we know that very often, behind those small and medium enterprises, actually, there can be minority groups. And so there again, there is quite a lot of interesting policy tools that tells us how to make sure that business dynamism really triggers to everybody. And the third pillar of this framework that we have at the OECD is looking at the inclusivity of institutions. So making sure that all the governance system, again, is done in a way that really actually brings in the contributions and participation of the minorities. I want to make a very quick point on partnerships as well. So I said this is all of the society approach that is needed. We haven't talked a lot about role that the private sector can play into this, but obviously when we're talking about discrimination and treatment and unequal treatment in the workplace, the employers and the companies have a major responsibility, and we have been working with some of them through the Business for Inclusive Growth Coalition. And interestingly, one of the findings from that work is that going back to the point that Faisal was making about creating a culture of solidarity. So, when you want to really create a mindset and a culture of equal treatment and promotion of inclusion and diversity, you need to start with the majority group. So it's with them that you really need to create the right tools that can create a case and you get support from the majority. The final very quick comment, the lived experience. This is also something that has been said, and really making sure that the solution really starts and ends with the minority groups. I see a radical, very promising change happening within the national statistical offices. They are themselves also incorporating the views of the minorities. And I think this is something that has been a tradition, when you look at the work that civil society has done for many years, foundation, etc. But it's now really the policymakers and the national statisticians that are also recognizing the importance of ensuring that the statistics are inclusive by design. So it's really how do we, we frame the questions, but also how we analyze and actually disseminate the findings. And so I just want to actually recall two very important initiatives, one by Canada, the StatCan, the National Statistical Office of Canada, another one by the UK, the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, and both really recognizing the importance of incorporating the lived experience of minorities into the creation of inclusive statistics.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to hand it over to Faisal, 2 minutes maximum.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of things that came to mind just listening to those comments there. One is, I think one of the interesting findings we've got is the mix between universal and targeted, and how you implement policies and how that helps to build solidarity, and the need to really think carefully about universal policies. So if you think in context in which there's high levels of prejudice that have been there historically, then to go in and target a particular group can sometimes cause backlash, because groups, think all these horrible things about this minority group or this Indigenous group. And so the ability of politicians and policymakers to think about both universal and targeted at the same time, and to sequence those things to bring people on board, is really important in having success on these policies. And just to say, because I know it's the final moments, I mean, better data is about highlighting and making these groups visible, but it's also about embarrassing organizations and embarrassing different institutions when they don't even do the basics on representation. And so I think it is really important to demand the private sector also publishes data on who they're hiring and the proportions. And yeah, just a final point, you know, we cannot address inequality and exclusion, either income or wealth-based or group-based, without doing the solidarity building work. We need groups to trust each other more, because otherwise there's no political pressure to do something about discrimination, because you've divided groups and groups think that it's okay, they think it's their fault. So solidarity building must be at the center of any program to address inequality. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to attempt to repeat everything being said. Very, very good input from all the speakers. We know we need legislation assuring rights and protection. We need policies. We need to think about the economy and the inequality stroke exclusion dimensions that FISA addressed and others. We need to think about partnerships and how to take this forward together. We need to mobilize more action. And I'd like to also remind us all, which is a key point for some of us on the Norwegian side right now, 10 days ago, away from the anniversary of 22nd July terror attack, that this is also an individual responsibility to take forward. The battle against racism, prejudice, Richard talked about it and others touched upon it as well. We promised each other here in Norway after 22nd July that we would take every debate and we would approach with sort of respectful listening ears, but we would help each other, back each other, and take every debate about multiculturalism, tolerance, etc., in order to help stop the development of attitudes and values sooner. And I think that's also a point important to take with us going out of this meeting, that this is also an individual responsibility. And if we are going to stop the polarization, reduce the polarization and the divisive societies that we see developing around us, we all have to contribute, actually. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining. I'd like to thank all the speakers, and I'd like to thank Canada and Costa Rica for co-hosting and the leadership on these issues. And then here, we must just join in more of us and make sure that this movement is building stronger and getting more political muscles as we go forward, because the alternative is not one that either of us want. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.